There are places in this country where silence has weight, where the night doesn't simply fall, it descends, crawling over dry earth and rotting wood like fog with teeth. My name is Evan Hartley, 33 years old, raised in Arizona, shaped by road dust and childhood summers wandering national parks with my grandpa. He taught me two rules that I didn't fully respect until I drove my Volkswagen into places I shouldn't have. Never assume a campsite is empty just because nobody's there. And never stay where the earth looks like it's trying to forget humans existed. I should have remembered those rules the night I followed a rust-faded sign pointing toward a campground that wasn't on any visitor map anymore. I'd set out alone in early autumn. When the crowds thin out, the nights sharpen, and the forests start to whisper about winter coming. I wanted solitude. I wanted to restore something in myself the city had been draining for months. My Volkswagen, a white 1987 Vanagon with a rattling cabinet and curtains that smelled faintly of pine and old coffee, had always been my escape hatch. Behind that steering wheel, the world felt survivable. I was headed for a popular campsite in a national park. I won't name which one because once you hear this, you won't want to look at it the same way. But a road closure redirected me. The ranger I'd asked for guidance spoke slowly, like he had to force his mouth to move. You can try the old South Loop, he said. It's technically open. But folks don't usually go that way anymore. Not since he cut himself off, stared past me as though something behind my shoulder needed monitoring. Not since what? I asked, but he just pointed down the road. I should have heard the warning in his silence. I should have cared more about the way he swallowed hard, like a man remembering something he'd rather forget. But I was tired, and the sun was already dissolving behind the ridge. That's the thing about fear. Sometimes you don't recognize the danger until you're already inside it. The turnoff looked nearly swallowed by overgrowth. Half buried in brush was the sign. South Loop Campground, 2 miles. The arrow leaned like it wanted to fall into the dirt. When the gravel clattered under my tires, the air changed. Cooler. Still. The forest was so dense, even the wind seemed unsure how to move between the trees. It was as if the land knew I was driving somewhere meant to be left alone. I crept down that narrow road as dusk bled into night. No other cars. No trailheads. Just forest that pushed in on both sides like shoulders pressing close. When the campground finally appeared, it didn't feel discovered. It felt uncovered, like I'd brushed away earth from a buried thing. 30 sites, maybe. All empty. The fire pits were choked with leaves and ash long dampened by seasons of rain. The picnic tables sagged under moss and rot. The scent hit me then, that smell of wood that has spent too long in darkness. Old, sour, almost human in its decay. But I kept going, circling until I found a spot near the tree line that looked the least ruined. My headlights cut across faded paint on the campground post. Site 14. I told myself the isolation was perfect. What more could someone like me ask for? No generators humming from fifth wheels. No drunken RV groups playing country music at midnight. No strangers staring too long at my van, wondering why I preferred such small spaces over comfortable ones. Alone. That's what I wanted. I didn't consider that loneliness becomes a threat in certain places. I leveled the van, popped the top, and heated a can of soup on my little stove. A quiet meal in the quiet dark. But the forest wasn't entirely silent, just wrong. The sounds were off by degrees. Too much pause between the chirps. Rustling leaves that stopped too abruptly. No distant owls or coyotes. Just waiting. At first I chalked it up to my imagination. Long weeks of stress make the mind search for shapes and shadows. After dinner, I stepped outside with my flashlight to take in the stars. What little of them filtered through the thick branches. The air felt heavy, like humidity without water. I noticed the ground near the fire pit had deep grooves in the soil, perfectly straight, as though something narrow and sharp had been dragged repeatedly across it. Animals, maybe. But the lines were too exact, too consistent. Like someone marking territory. A breeze shivered through the trees, the first real wind I'd felt since turning off the main road, and something about that movement made me feel watched. My spine locked up, and I scanned the dark beyond the glow of my lantern. Nothing moved. I told myself to breathe, to stop treating shadows like threats. I climbed into the van, zipped the windows shut, and settled into my sleeping bag. But sleep doesn't come easy when the world outside feels like it's holding its breath. The first noise came around midnight, the crack of twigs near the back of the van. Not heavy footsteps, more like something crawling. I froze, listened, silence, then a slow scrape under the chassis, metal against dirt, just once. My rational mind sprinted ahead. Raccoon, stray dog, maybe a coyote sniffing for food. Nothing unusual for a woodland campsite. But my skin didn't believe the logic. I reached out and shut off the lantern. The darkness inside the van grew thick enough to taste, every sound heightened, my pulse hammering through the mattress, my breath shaking the curtains. Another scrape, closer, directly beneath me. Then, tapping, soft, rhythmic, against the metal floor under my hips. 1, 2, 3. Stop. 4 taps faster. Stop. 3 taps again. A pattern. Not random, not animal. I held my breath, as though breathing would give me away. I wanted to whisper to the dark, "I'm not here. You're mistaken." This campsite is still abandoned, but that's the thing. Something knew I was there, something that had been here long before my engine sputtered into the clearing. I pressed my ear to the thin carpet and listened. The tapping stopped. The forest outside held its unnatural quiet again, like a house where someone stands behind the door, waiting for you to knock. Every instinct told me to get in the driver's seat and leave, but fear can paralyze as easily as it motivates. And part of me, the arrogant part that came here seeking solitude, clung to denial. It's nothing, just a critter. Don't be dramatic. Eventually, I managed to convince myself to lie back down. I stared into the blackness until my vision fizzled with colors that weren't really there. Sleep finally found me in quick, shallow bursts, until a thud against the underside of the van jerked me awake like an electric shock. Then another, harder. Something was hitting the metal as if testing its strength. I scrambled up, banged my elbow on the cabinet, and reached for the lantern. My fingers shook so violently the switch almost slipped from me. When the light flared on, it filled the van with a weak yellow safety, but it did nothing for the darkness outside. Silence again. Complete silence. I crawled forward to peek through the front curtains. The picnic table, the trees, the fire ring, unchanged. No shapes, no eyes peering from the brush. But something did catch my attention. Those grooves in the soil, the straight lines I noticed earlier, there were more of them now, new ones, fresh, leading directly from the tree line to the rear tires of my van. A trail, as though something had dragged itself across the ground to find me, and then dragged itself away again. My tongue went dry. My heartbeat felt too loud for my ribs to contain. I shut the curtains quickly, as though covering the windows could block out whatever intelligence was studying me from that forest. Inside the van, surrounded by thin steel walls, I had never felt more exposed. I sat there until my back ached and my legs went numb, waiting for another sound, another signal that I wasn't imagining all of this. Hours stretched long and tight. I kept one hand around the lantern, the other poised near the ignition keys. At some point, the sky outside shifted from pitch to a dark blue bruise. Night retreating. Dawn thinking about rising. I had survived the hours where darkness owns the world. But I learned something that night. In places humans abandon, something else takes over, and it does not appreciate us coming back. Morning felt like a temporary truce. When I finally stepped outside, the air was cold enough that my breath showed. The ground looked different in daylight, less like soil and more like old skin stretched over something waiting underneath. Birds still didn't sing, no insects buzzed. Normal morning life simply hadn't returned. I forced myself to examine the grooves in the dirt by the rear tires. In daylight, they were unmistakable, sharp channels cutting through the decomposing leaves, about as wide as 2 fingers repeating in parallel lines, carved in straight trajectories that looked too deliberate, too controlled. I crouched and traced one with a stick. The direction was obvious, from the tree line toward my van. But then, halfway under the vehicle, the tracks emerged again, continuing past my campsite and deeper into the woods on the opposite side. Whatever came for me had also moved on. Not a wandering animal, not something searching randomly. It had a path, a destination. And last night, I must have been a stop along the way. A shiver crept up my spine and settled there. I boiled water for coffee on the portable stove, hands trembling so hard I almost spilled the pot. I told myself I would pack up, get out before the sun climbed over the ridge, leave this forgotten place to whatever owned it now. But when fear rules your decisions, everything you want turns into a struggle. My van wouldn't start. The engine whirred, coughed, and died. Again and again. No matter how carefully I turned the key, how long I held it, the ignition refused to catch. My battery was fine. My fuel was fine. The machine that had taken me across half the country suddenly felt like a coffin with wheels. I should have checked it the moment I woke up. Maybe something had been disconnected, tampered with. But the thought of crawling underneath the chassis where the tapping came from last night filled me with a different kind of paralysis. I swallowed hard. This was not normal. Vans don't just decide to fail at the exact moment you desperately need to escape. I grabbed my phone. No signal. Not even an emergency bar. When systems fail all at once, it's not coincidence. It's isolation. I leaned against the van, eyes scanning the tree shadows that poured like ink between the trunks. I had the distinct sensation that the forest was waiting for my next move, waiting to see whether panic or reason would choose the path for me. I inhaled slowly, steadying my shaking nerves. I forced myself to think. I had food, water, a fire starter, enough resources to last a couple of days if necessary. The road back was just 2 miles, walkable if my legs didn't betray me the way my courage was already starting to. I could leave the van behind, hike back to the closed road and hope with ranger or passing car. It was the rational choice. But the rational choice didn't erase the memory of that tapping, like something under the van had been learning me through metal. I packed my essentials into a backpack, water, flashlight, the knife my grandfather gave me, a heavy sweater. I slipped the keys into my pocket out of habit, even though I doubted they would help me anymore. I locked the van, another instinct that felt pointless in a place where the threats didn't use doors, and started toward the gravel road. I'd made it maybe 20 yards when I noticed something on the campground post for Site 14. At first, it looked like another scrape in the paint. But when I stepped closer, my pulse stumbled. 4 horizontal lines, then a diagonal slash. A tally mark, fresh, scratched deep into the wood, splinters still clinging like the wound on a scar. Not vandalism, not weathering. It had been added since I'd arrived. This place wasn't just abandoned, it was counting. And last night, it counted me. I backed away like the post itself might reach out and grab me. No more staying calm, no more pretending this was explainable. I turned and hurried down the gravel road, refusing to look over my shoulder because some primitive part of me believed that eye contact, just one glance, might invite something to step into view. The forest pressed close again, noise deaf and motionless. Here and there, sunbeams cut through the canopy, but they looked pale and sickly, like light that had forgotten how to warm. After a few minutes, the creeping sensation eased. I thought distance was helping me feel safer. Then I noticed I'd stopped seeing my own footprints. I turned to check behind me. The road looked undisturbed, smooth, untouched. My boots should have left marks in the soft gravel, but there was nothing. No sign I had come from where I'd just walked. I stared, jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. I looked down at the ground directly under me, no footprint. I stepped to the left. Gravel shifted under my weight, but when I lifted my foot, the stones rolled back, wiping away any hint that I had stepped there at all. It was like the road refused to record me, as though the wilderness had always planned to erase my presence, first from sight, then from memory. Every instinct screamed that maybe I hadn't left the campground behind, not really, that the forest itself was a closed loop, drawing me back no matter how far I walked. I broke into a near run, lungs burning, eyes stinging from cold air and terror. The road curved, dipped slightly, then straightened. I recognized the shape of it. Too familiar. Identical. It was the same bend I'd taken leaving Site 14. I slowed to a stop, my breath punched out of me like I'd been hit. I was back. Exactly where I started. The campground map nailed to the information board, its colors bleached by years of sun, rustled faintly in sudden wind as though laughing at me. My knees buckled. I dropped to the dirt as nausea swelled tight through my chest. This wasn't a navigation error. This wasn't confusion. Something about the land reset the moment I tried to leave. The campsite had claimed me. I stood again, shaky but determined. If the road refused to take me out, then I'd face the center of this decay instead of trying to escape it. Running blindly only made the trap tighten. I needed eyes open, mind alert. I walked back to Site 14 because at least there I had shelter. If daylight was just a short-lived mercy, I needed to use what time remained to understand the rules of this place. Inside the van, I forced myself to open the rear hatch, the exact section under which something had been tapping. My hands hesitated before I crouched, lowering myself to scan the space beneath. The soil under the van was churned up, not paw prints, not hoof marks. The grooves I saw earlier were now deeper, freshly disturbed as though something had circled the van while I slept. And in the center of those lines lay an object, small, round, dirty. I reached for it with a stick, rolling it into view. A bottle cap, silver with a red logo. I recognized it instantly. It wasn't mine. It was from a brand that stopped being produced over 10 years ago. Someone else had camped here once, someone who didn't leave on their own terms. I stared at that bottle cap longer than I should have, because the fear it carried wasn't about what left it, but about what kept it. I backed away, slammed the hatch shut, and pressed my hands against the cool metal, forcing my breathing into rhythm. 3 seconds in, 4 seconds out. I needed to think, to plan. Night would return, and when it did, the thing under the ground wouldn't remain underneath. I gathered fallen wood and dry grass, though part of me wondered whether fire even mattered here. Whether the darkness that lived in this forgotten campground cared about flame, or whether it would simply wait for the light to fail and continue its counting. By late afternoon, the sky bruised over faster than it should, the kind of early dusk that feels like a warning, not a shift in weather. The forest exhaled a long, low sigh. The wind returned, and the earth beneath me seemed to settle, like something shifting its position before rising. Night was coming, and now I knew. Whatever lingered here didn't want my body. It wanted to make me part of the place. Darkness settled earlier than it had any right to. Not a gentle fade, but a shut door. One moment the trees were shapes, the next they were walls. I crouched beside the fire ring, hands fumbling with flint and steel, striking again and again until sparks leapt into the dry grass I'd gathered. A flame caught, spreading through the kindling, and soon a small fire clawed at the night. My only defense, the light didn't feel like warmth. It felt like a line drawn in the sand. The forest remained silent. I sat close to the flames, back pressed to the van to limit how many directions something could approach from. The lantern inside the vehicle, but I didn't dare move from the fire. Darkness was where it lived. That much I had learned. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time twisted here. Then leaves shifted beyond the glow. Soft. Deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the trees. Nothing. But I could feel eyes. Not animal eyes. Something patient, intelligent. It watched the way a person watches, measuring. Another scrape against the earth. Farther than before, but purposeful. I called out without meaning to. Who's there? The question got swallowed. Sound didn't travel in this place. The night had no interest in helping me communicate. I tightened my fingers around the flashlight. The fire cracked like bones. Fear sharpened every sensation, my heartbeat thudding loud enough that maybe the ground could feel it. Then came the taps, not under the van this time. From the trees. 1, 2, 3. Stop. 4 taps. Faster. Stop. 3 again. Same pattern as last night. Not random. Not nature. A message. Something moved at the edge of the light. A draft of cold swept the campsite, unnatural cold that didn't belong to the season or the hour. I aimed my beam at the sound and saw the grooves I'd noticed earlier, fresh ones, extending from the forest toward me in long, straight lines, and they were still being carved. The earth was parting inches at a time, as though tiny invisible blades scored it from below, slowly crawling toward me. I stumbled back, nearly falling into the fire. Sparks erupted. A hiss. The flames flickered, shrinking slightly as if recoiling from what approached. Then I heard it. Breathing. From beneath the soil. Wet. Labored. Too close. I backed up until my spine hit the van, breath trembling in sharp, short bursts. The ground bulged, the grooves deepened. Something below the earth pressed upward like a body rolling beneath a sheet. I screamed without sound, my voice strangled by terror. Then the breathing stopped. The bulge froze. I didn't dare blink. The soil cracked. Just a hairline split. Just enough for a glint of moisture to shine through, like an eye peering up from under the surface. I lunged sideways into the driver's seat, hands slamming the door shut. I locked it instinctively, though against what I couldn't say. Metal felt safer than air. The van shuddered. Something hit the underside again. Hard. Then again, angry, testing. I twisted the key, knowing it had failed earlier, but hoping fear had changed the odds. The starter word. Caught. Stalled. Please, please. Another hit from below. A violent, heavy thud. My vision blurred with panic. I turned the key harder, as if pressure translated into prayer. The engine coughed, then roared alive. Headlights exploded through the campground, throwing twisted shapes across the trees. For a second, the ground pulsed. The soil rose and fell like the earth itself was breathing in frustration. I slammed the van into gear and floored it. Gravel spit from the tires. The van lurched forward. The headlights revealed grooves everywhere now, circling my sight, weaving through others, marking trails that led to every campground post. Tally marks slashed into each one, dozens, maybe hundreds. This wasn't a place people merely visited. It was a place that kept count. I raced down the gravel road, eyes wide, praying I wouldn't loop again. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles drained white. I refused to look in the mirrors, afraid I'd see dirt rising like water behind me. The turn that had trapped me before came into view. I floored the gas. The van surged forward, and the road didn't bend this time. It opened into the main highway, asphalt dark but solid like freedom wrapped in tar. I could have cried. I didn't stop, didn't slow. I drove until the forest thinned and cell signal bars flickered into existence, until my breath stopped sounding like a drowning man's last attempt. When I finally pulled into a gas station miles away, the attendant was hosing down the concrete. His head jerked up as I skidded to a stop at the pump. He stared at me like I'd arrived from the deep woods, naked and bloodied. "Mister, you okay?" I didn't know how to answer. I probably looked half feral, sweaty, wild-eyed, covered in dirt, but I managed a stiff nod. He pointed to my rear bumper. "What happened to your van?" I stepped around to look. The metal was scratched to hell. Not dents, not rust. Tally marks. 4 horizontal lines. 1 diagonal slash. Dozens of them. All scored deep into the body of the van, straight through the paint shining silver in the station lights. It had been counting me. Every minute I'd stayed. I backed away from the van like it could still bite me. The attendant watched me for what felt like a full minute before speaking again, his voice lowering like he was afraid of the answer. "Where'd you camp last night?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out, because naming that place felt like giving it permission to follow me here. Finally, I whispered, "I took a wrong turn." His jaw tightened. He motioned toward the road behind me. "There are places out there folks ain't supposed to go anymore. Places they let the land take back. You find one of those, you don't stay, you don't ask why. You just go." I nodded, my throat burning with shame, because I had stayed. I had asked why, and the dark had answered. After paying, I sat in the driver's seat and stared at the interior cabinets and curtains that once made this van feel like a sanctuary. Now they felt like walls that had barely protected me from what lived beneath forgotten soil. But I drove away anyway, because movement is sometimes the only thing that proves you're still alive. I didn't return home directly. For weeks, I camped only in crowded RV parks, surrounded by humans and noise, and the comforting imperfections of civilization. But no matter where I parked at night, I could never fully relax. Each creak of the van, each shifting shadow across a tent, every twig that snapped in the dark, I remembered. The tally marks were repainted, carefully sanded, erased from sight, not from memory. Because fear isn't something you leave behind in a campground. Fear is what you carry out so nothing inside you gets left behind. Months later, I met a retired ranger in a diner near Yosemite. His hands shook when he reached for his coffee cup. We got to talking. Small talk at first, then the kind of questions two wanderers ask each other. You travel alone? Yeah, in a Volkswagen. He nodded, but slowly, as if that detail troubled him. He told me something then. Not directly, not clearly, but enough. National parks are full of stories that get buried deeper than abandoned campgrounds. People go missing. Campsites close quietly. Maps get updated without explanation. There are places out there, he said, the forest doesn't want us taking back. And eventually, the forest gets what it wants. Ever since that night, I've learned how to listen, really listen, to the ground, the trees, the silence that presses against the windows when darkness comes too fast. If I feel even a whisper of wrongness, I go. I don't wait for tapping. I don't wait for grooves to reach my tires. I don't wait for tally marks. Because there are campgrounds where something ancient still waits for the next person who thinks they're just passing through, where the earth remembers footsteps and is eager to make new ones. So if you're out there traveling the country, living the dream in your Volkswagen, finding beauty where crowds don't gather, chasing peace in forgotten corners of the map, hear me now. When a place feels too quiet, respect that silence. When the firelight casts shapes the world shouldn't make, trust your instincts. When soil looks freshly disturbed and no footprints remain, get back in the van, turn the key. Don't look back. Because some national park campgrounds aren't abandoned, they're waiting. And once the night starts counting, it never stops. I didn't understand the real danger of America's remote RV trails until the night the roads seemed to swallow my Volkswagen whole, leaving me alone with nothing but the hum of the engine and a long stretch of darkness pressing in like a living thing. I'd always believed that solitude was its own kind of safety, a buffer between me and the noise of crowded campgrounds. But that belief shattered the moment the trail bent away from the last patch of cell service and left me with only my instincts to rely on. Back then, I thought instincts were something solid, something you could trust. Now I know they can warp under fear, twisting into warnings you try to ignore until it's too late. The trip had started out simple enough. I was 34 at the time, a Colorado local who'd spent more weekends on forest roads than in my own living room. The plan that night was just a long drive through the San Juan backcountry in my old Volkswagen Westphalia, a faded blue tin top I'd rebuilt with my own hands. I'd named it Coyote because the engine had this sly little whine to it when climbing grades, almost like it was laughing under its breath. I'd taken Coyote everywhere. Utah deserts, Montana, fire roads, Arizona slot canyon rims. The van was more familiar to me than most people in my life. This trip, though, felt different. I'd met up with a friend earlier that week, a guy named Marcus who'd been exploring a network of remote RV trails that branched off an old mining route near Dolores. He was the kind of person who camped harder than he worked, a wanderer at heart with a habit of chasing rumors of hidden campsites. When he told me about a place called Eagle Wash, he spoke like he'd stumbled onto a secret. Said the valley was silent in a way that didn't feel natural, like the land was holding its breath. I laughed it off at the time, but I'd seen the way his eyes lingered, as if he wasn't sure if he'd gone there voluntarily or been drawn in. Still, I decided to check it out. Maybe because something in his tone stuck with me. Maybe because part of me liked the idea of proving the place wrong, showing myself that silence was nothing but silence. The first few hours of the drive were peaceful. The mountains were dark silhouettes against a fading sky, and the air grew colder as I wound deeper into the back roads. The smell of pine drifted through the cracked window, mixing with the familiar scent of old upholstery and engine warm-up. I had a thermos of coffee wedged between the seats, a playlist humming quietly from a speaker clipped to the dashboard, and the kind of steady confidence that comes from years of doing something alone. It was one of those nights when the wilderness doesn't feel hostile, just big, ancient, patient. But that shifted somewhere around mile marker 28. The trail narrowed without warning, the trees leaning inward like they were listening. The temperature dipped sharply, enough to fog the glass from the inside. I tried brushing it away with my sleeve, but the condensation smeared into thin, wavering lines that were hard to see through. I told myself it was nothing, just elevation. Cold pockets happen. Forests change character at night. Still, I found myself leaning forward, fingers tightening around the wheel. The first strange thing I noticed wasn't sound, it was the absence of it. The normal night noises you grow used to on these trips had faded. No crickets, no distant rush of wind, no shifting branches, just the sputter of Coyote's engine and this thick, suffocating quiet that seemed to settle right behind my ears. It made the back of my neck prickle, like someone had drawn a cold finger along my spine. I tried shaking it off. I'd camped alone enough to know that silence isn't supernatural. Sometimes the land is just still. But the quiet pressed in hard, heavier than it should have been. A living kind of stillness. By the time I turned onto the last stretch of trail Marcus had told me about, I could feel a strange tension crawling under my ribs. It wasn't fear exactly, more like anticipation mixed with doubt. The trail climbed sharply before leveling into a narrow ridge. Below it, I could barely make out the valley he'd described. It was pitch black, an empty bowl of shadow that swallowed the faint starlight. I kept going because stopping felt worse. Stopping meant giving the darkness a chance to rise up and stare back at me. When I finally reached a flat enough patch to pull over, I killed the engine and listened. The sudden lack of vibration felt like stepping off a moving walkway. Everything around me felt too still, too heavy, as if the world had paused mid-breath. I slid out of the driver's seat, my boots landing on gravel with a crunch that sounded unnaturally loud. The air was cold enough to numb my nose, and the smell of wet earth drifted from the trees. I flicked on my headlamp and scanned the area. Nothing moved. No wandering deer, no rustling bushes, not even the usual scatter of moths around my light. It was like the entire valley had been scrubbed clean of life. I had this sudden urge to get back inside the van, but I forced myself to take a short walk around. I always did a perimeter check when camping alone. It gave me a sense of control, like I was establishing my awareness before settling in. But as I walked the small circle around my campsite, I noticed something off. The ground was oddly packed, not loose dirt or gravel like the rest of the trail. It felt disturbed, not recently, but not old either. Like something heavy had been dragged across it again and again until the earth compressed. The headlamp flickered, just for a second, but long enough to make my breath hitch. I turned toward the van, telling myself I was done checking for the night. The urge to be inside with the doors shut was too strong to ignore. I climbed into the back, set my sleeping bag across the folded-down bench, and tried to settle into the familiar routine. The inside of Coyote always felt like a refuge. Soft humming walls, old wood paneling, stickers from trips past scattered across the cabinets. But tonight, even those comforts couldn't drown out the unease. When I switched off the interior lights, the darkness felt closer than it should have been. Thicker. I could hear my heartbeat echoing in my ears, loud and slow. Sometime after midnight, just as I felt myself drifting, I heard the first sound since arriving. A single knock. Not on the van, out in the trees. A hollow, deliberate strike, like wood on wood. I froze, eyes snapping open. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. That knock didn't belong to the forest. I knew that instinctively. It carried intention, rhythm, a pulse that didn't fit with animals or falling branches. I waited, listening. A second knock echoed, farther away this time, but clearer. The same crisp, measured strike. I sat up in the sleeping bag, my breath trapped tight in my chest. People camp differently out here. They call out if they're nearby, they use lights, they don't sneak through the trees in the dead of night, knocking on things. The third knock came from the opposite direction. Not farther. Closer. Something was moving. Not in a straight line, not wandering, but circling. And for the first time that night, I wondered if Marcus had really told me everything about Eagle Wash. I knew I should stay still, keep the lights off, and let the darkness hide me, but curiosity has a way of slipping past caution when you're alone, miles from anyone who could help. I eased forward, pressing my palm lightly against the window, trying to peer through the glass without making noise. My breath fogged the cold surface instantly, blurring everything into a smear of shifting shapes. I wiped it away with my sleeve, slow enough not to draw attention. Outside, the trees stood motionless, black spines jutting into the sky. Nothing moved between them. But the knocks. They kept coming. 3 beats, then silence. 2, then 1. Always changing distance, always shifting direction. Like mapping me, like marking me. There's a moment on nights like this when your body knows something your mind refuses to accept. A tightening under the ribs, a weight behind the eyes, a tiny shaking in the hands you try to ignore. All of it pressing the same message into your bones. You are not alone. I tried to steady my breathing, tried to tell myself it could be someone else camping nearby, someone messing around or signaling a partner. But I'd driven far enough to know these trails aren't crowded. Even on weekends, maybe 2 or 3 rigs pass through. On a weekday night in off-season, nobody should have been out there. Nobody but me. A sudden cold draft brushed the back of my neck and I jolted before realizing it was just air leaking from the window vent. But my nerves didn't settle. The knocks had stopped, replaced by something worse. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, pacing along the gravel outside the van. Not fast, not frantic. Just moving with a slow confidence that made my mouth go dry. I reached for the small flashlight I kept by the bed, but my fingers trembled so badly I knocked it over. The clatter echoed far louder than it should have in the confined space. The footsteps outside froze. I held my breath. For several seconds, nothing moved. The world went completely still again. Even the van felt like it stopped settling. My heartbeat thudded so loudly, I was sure whatever was outside could hear it. Then the footsteps resumed, only now they were closer. They scraped lightly against the dirt, moving along the passenger side as if studying the outline of the vehicle. I could picture them, boots or bare feet or something else entirely, dragging just slightly, testing the gravel. The uncertainty of what made the sound was worse than seeing a person outright. At least a person had logic. A person had boundaries, but this felt like curiosity, stretched thin and hungry. My mind raced through possibilities. Elk? Too controlled. Bear? The steps were too measured and bears don't circle. People? No one human walks with that uneven testing cadence. It felt off, unnatural in a way I couldn't explain. When the steps reached the rear of the van, something brushed the bumper. Just once. A soft scrape, like fingers gliding along metal. I snapped. I lunged forward to have yanked the curtains aside and shone the flashlight beam into the darkness. Nothing. Just trees. Dead still. No shape hiding between them. No movement. But the air was wrong. Colder. Heavy with a damp scent I hadn't noticed before. Something like wet stone mixed with decaying leaves. I swung the light in a wide arc, breathing faster, scanning for any hint of motion. Still nothing. Only the quiet. Only the suffocating emptiness pressing against the windows. I pulled the curtains shut again and sank back onto the mattress, my pulse pounding so loud it vibrated in my teeth. I knew I should grab my keys, start the engine, and get the hell out of there. But another part of me, the stubborn, rationalizing part, kept insisting that fear exaggerates everything, that maybe the steps were just the engine cooling, the knocks just branches settling. Denial is a strange comfort when you're scared. It gives you a reason to stay still, a reason to tell yourself you're safe when every instinct screams otherwise. I forced myself to lie down, though every muscle stayed taut, ready to spring up again. Minutes crawled by, maybe an hour. At some point, exhaustion crept in despite the fear. My eyelids weighed heavy, fluttering against the quiet. I drifted in and out of shallow sleep, each time jerking awake at the smallest sound, but nothing returned. No steps, no knocks, only that oppressive silence. Eventually, I did fall asleep, and when I woke, the world was wrong. It wasn't sound that woke me, nor light filtering through the curtains. It was the feeling that the van had shifted. Not much, just a subtle tilt, as if one of the wheels had sunk deeper into the earth. I pushed myself up and blinked at the dim morning light leaking through the windows. My throat was dry, my body stiff from the tension of the night before. I stepped out of the sleeping bag carefully, like half expecting someone, or something, to be standing just outside. When I finally opened the sliding door, a rush of cold morning air hit me. Pine, damp soil, a faint metallic tang I couldn't place, but nothing else. The campsite looked exactly as it had the night before, except for one detail. The rear passenger side tire had sunk 3 inches into the ground. Not mud, there hadn't been rain for days. The earth was packed too tightly, yet the tire sat in a depression perfectly shaped to its diameter, as if something had pressed it down with unnatural force. I crouched beside it, running my hand along the rim. The soil around the tire wasn't disturbed. No footprints, no drag marks, just that smooth, unnatural impression. A wave of unease washed through me. I stood up slowly and scanned the tree line. Morning light filtered through the branches, but something about the forest felt unchanged, still too quiet, too motionless. I checked the other tires, all normal. Only the one closest to where the footsteps had stopped was affected. I tried convincing myself it could be some weird settling pattern in the ground, maybe a pocket of softer soil. But the logic was thin, and I knew it. When I looked closer, I realized something else. The forest floor around the van had been brushed clean. Not swept exactly, but cleared. Pine needles, dirt, small stones, all pushed outward into a faint circular boundary around the vehicle. Not evenly, not perfectly, but unmistakably intentional. A boundary. As if something had walked around the van in a slow, deliberate loop. I stood there frozen, my breath visible in the cool air. The back of my neck prickled again, the same sensation from the night before. A cold realization crept in. I hadn't imagined the footsteps. Something had been out here. Something that moved with intelligence, not instinct. I packed up the van in record time, tossed everything inside without my usual order, slammed the doors shut and scrambled into the driver's seat. My hands shook as I turned the key. Coyote's engine stuttered, coughed, and then caught with a whine. Relief flooded through me, but then as the engine settled into a low idle, I heard something from the woods behind me. Not a knock. Not a footstep, a breath, a long, slow exhale that drifted through the silent morning like something ancient waking up. I shifted into gear instantly, gravel spitting under the tires. The van lurched forward, climbing out of the depression with more resistance than it should have had, like something reluctant to let it go. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes glued to the trail ahead, hands tight on the wheel, heart pounding hard enough to bruise bone. But even as I put distance between myself and that valley, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't done with me. I didn't know it yet, but the real danger wasn't leaving Eagle Wash. It was realizing what followed me out. The road twisted sharply downhill, and every bump felt amplified, like the van was jittering beneath me instead of rolling. I kept glancing at the mirrors even though I knew I wouldn't see anything. Whatever had breathed behind me didn't move the way people or animals did. It didn't need to be seen to be felt. And even as sunlight sharpened the edges of the woods, pushing back the night's shadows, I couldn't shake the certainty that something had shifted when I drove away. Not just in the forest, inside me. I told myself that once I got back onto the main Forest Service road, once the trees thinned and the sky widened, the fear would loosen. I'd start thinking clearly again. But the farther I drove, the stronger the unease became, like a wire pulled tighter with every mile. When I reached the fork where two washed-out trails split, I slowed and rubbed the stiffness from my face. Normally, I'd check the map, maybe step out to stretch. This time, I kept the engine running, eyes darting between the trees. The forest looked normal. Cold morning light, drifting mist, branches stirring slightly in the breeze. But the silence hadn't lifted. It hung heavy, muffling the world, thickening the air. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. I took the left fork, the longer route, but the safer one. The right side had rockfall issues, unpredictable bank failures, and a steep ravine. Any other day, I might have taken it anyway, anything to get out faster. But something deep down insisted I stay on the known path. Fear isn't always panic. Sometimes it's a quiet, steady voice telling you you're one wrong choice away from disappearing. A few minutes later, the radio flickered on even though I hadn't touched it. Static first. Soft, broken, like someone whispering through crushed leaves. Then a crackle so sharp I flinched. The screen stayed dark. The volume knob didn't turn. It wasn't the radio picking up anything, it was interference. Something external forcing its way into the wiring. My chest tightened. I reached forward, tapping the console with the edge of my knuckle. The static deepened, a distorted rumble that vibrated through the dashboard. Then it cut out just as suddenly as it started. Electric systems glitch. I knew that, especially in older vans. But something about that static felt familiar, like the low-frequency hum of that breath behind me. Deep, exhaled, almost resonant. I shook my head, refusing to follow that thought where it wanted to go. By the time I reached the first clearing, the sun had risen fully, turning the peaks gold. In the distance, the valley where I'd spent the night looked calm, peaceful, as if nothing had happened. I pulled over and cut the engine, needing a moment to gather myself. When the noise died, the silence rushed in again, dense and wrong, like the forest had been holding it in all morning and finally released it in a single suffocating wave. I stepped out cautiously, boots touching the ground with a crunch I barely recognized after hours of oppressive quiet. The cold bit into my nose, my breath fogging in short bursts. I walked a few steps away from the van and turned to look at it. Coyote sat exactly as it should, a little dirty, a little crooked, a little tired, my old familiar companion. But I couldn't shake the image of the tire sunk deep into the earth, the boundary quietly traced around the campsite. I half expected to see marks here too, some trace that the forest had followed with me. Instead, I found something else. A single pine cone rested on the hood, perfectly centered. I stared at it for a full 10 seconds, trying to convince myself it had fallen from the branches above. But there was no tree directly over the van, no reason for it to land exactly there. No reason for it to be placed upright, its scales all intact, undamaged. My stomach nodded. I walked toward it slowly, each step feeling like it carried the weight of something I didn't yet understand. When I reached the hood, I reached out and touched the pine cone gently. It was cold, too cold, as if it had been sitting in the shade for hours, not lying exposed on metal warming in the early sun. I picked it up and held it for a moment. Then, without knowing why, I tossed it into the brush. It hit the ground with a soft rustle, rolled once, and settled. It seemed like nothing, truly nothing. But the moment it disappeared into the undergrowth, the forest shifted. Not the leaves, not the branches, the sense of it. Like something turned its attention toward me. I didn't plan to speak, but words slipped out before I could stop them. I know you're there. The sound of my own voice startled me. Too small, too thin, too exposed. The forest didn't respond. Not with sound, at least. But the air changed, growing colder, denser, as if inhaling slowly. I backed toward the van, sliding into the driver's seat and closing the door with a shaky hand. My pulse thudded in my temples. My fingers trembled on the ignition. I didn't wait for my breath to steady. I didn't wait for courage or clarity. I started the engine and drove. The road widened as I descended into the lower forest, and ordinary sounds finally began filtering back. Bird calls, rustling leaves, the distant rush of a creek. Tiny, familiar noises that should have comforted me. Instead, they made me aware of how wrong the silence had been, how abnormal, how deliberate. Once I hit a paved stretch, my body loosened slightly. Civilization felt close enough to touch. The fear faded from panic into tension, then into a low hum of vigilance. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see something moving behind me, some shape stepping onto the road. But nothing followed. The woods behind me stayed still. By the time I reached a small town near Cortez, hunger had settled in my stomach like a knot. I pulled into a gravel lot beside a diner, parked crookedly, and sat there for a moment, just breathing, just trying to feel normal again. Inside, the warmth and clatter of dishes felt surreal. People laughed, talked, lived. None of them looked like they'd stepped out of a valley that had tried to swallow them whole. I slid into a booth and ordered coffee, hands still unsteady. About 10 minutes later, someone sat in the seat across from me. Marcus. He looked rough, eyes bloodshot, shoulders tense, a shakiness in his fingers I'd never seen. He didn't even greet me. He just studied my face like he was trying to confirm a ghost had followed me in. "You went to Eagle Wash, didn't you?" It wasn't a question, more like an accusation mixed with fear. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. My silence told him everything. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Did it touch the van?" I swallowed hard, the pine cone on the hood, the tire pressed deep into the earth, the clearing around the campsite, the footsteps circling, the breath. Yes. Marcus shut his eyes slowly, pressing thumb and forefinger to the bridge of his nose. When he opened them, something in his expression cracked, the calm facade slipping to reveal deep, churning fear. "I tried to warn you," he said, voice hushed, strained, "but I didn't know how. I didn't know if it would matter." He glanced around the diner, checking if anyone was listening. No one was. No one ever listens to the quiet conversations that matter most. Marcus leaned in even closer. "Listen carefully," he said. "It's not the valley you need to worry about." His voice lowered to almost a whisper. "It's what leaves with you." Marcus's words hit me with the weight of a falling branch, silent for a split second, then crushing. Something inside me resisted their meaning, pushed against it like a hand pressed to a wound. But denial is thin when fear already knows the truth. I stared at him, unable to speak. His eyes kept flicking to the door, to the windows, to the corners of the room, as if the thing he feared could step into the diner at any moment. When he finally met my gaze again, his voice softened, turning almost apologetic. "You need to leave this region today," he said. "Not tomorrow, not after lunch. Today. Now. And don't stop. Don't pull over. Don't take the scenic way. Just go." I swallowed hard. "You're not making sense." He leaned forward, lowering his voice even more. "That valley doesn't just sit there dormant. It chooses. It watches everything that enters, and sometimes it follows back things it finds interesting or things it finds alone." A chill slid down my spine. What follows you isn't a person, isn't an animal. It's something that shapes itself around your fear, something that doesn't need distance or light or permission. I felt my fingers tighten around the coffee mug. The ceramic was warm, but my hands shook like I was holding something frozen. Marcus continued, his voice cracking slightly. "My cousin went out there 3 years ago. Same place, same valley, same silence, same feeling of being studied. He came home twitchy, paranoid. Said he felt something behind him everywhere he went. Doors opening by themselves, car alarms going off at night, things shifting in his room. At first, I thought he was just rattled, psychological stuff. Then he disappeared." I stared at him. The room suddenly felt too small, too warm, too alive with the clatter of silverware. "They found his campsite weeks later," Marcus whispered. "But not him. Not a trace." I set the mug down with a faint clink. Marcus looked at me like someone staring at a storm about to hit. "You need to get somewhere populated. Somewhere with noise. Somewhere not surrounded by trees." The diner suddenly felt like a safe place, an island of normality floating above a dark current. Part of me didn't want to leave, but the other part, the instinctual animal part, knew he was right. I could already feel something clinging to my awareness, like a wet cloth draped over my shoulders, heavy, unseen, waiting. Marcus lowered his voice again. "And when you go, Don't think about it. Don't look for signs of it. Don't acknowledge anything strange. It feeds on attention. Feeds? He didn't answer. Or maybe he couldn't. I stood slowly. My legs felt unsteady, like they didn't quite belong to me. Marcus didn't stop me. He just nodded once, heavy and defeated. Be careful. I left money on the table and stepped out into the cold midday air. The sunlight felt weaker than it should have been. The sound of passing cars didn't soothe me the way it should have. I walked to the van, every step feeling watched, not by people, but by something that drifted behind me like a shadow with breath. When I climbed inside, I closed the door firmly, almost reverently. The interior felt safe in that fragile way small shelters do, like a thin shell protecting you from a storm that doesn't care about walls. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands until the shaking stopped enough to focus. Just drive. Don't stop. Don't look back. I turned the key. The engine hesitated, a cough, a stutter, a strange low vibration, before roaring to life with an urgency that felt almost alive, as if even the van wanted to leave. I merged onto the highway and headed east, away from the mountains, away from the forests that had held their breath all night. I kept my eyes fixed forward, refusing to check the mirrors no matter how many times the hairs on my neck stood up. For the first hour, I heard nothing. Nothing but wind slipping around the van and the steady hum of tires on asphalt. Then, somewhere near the wide-open plains, the radio flickered again. Static. Not loud, not sharp, just a faint, low-frequency pulse, like a slow inhale. I gripped the wheel tighter. Do not acknowledge it. The static faded, as if disappointed. Another 30 minutes passed. The sky stretched open above me, endless and bright, a wide blue canvas brushing against the horizon. Out here, the land was flat enough to see for miles. No trees, no shadows, no valleys that watched. But fear doesn't disappear just because the scenery changes. It lingers. It hunts the quiet moments inside you. As I drove, my thoughts drifted back to the pine cone. The tire pressed into the earth, the perfect circle around my campsite, the footsteps that followed a pattern, mapping, measuring, and that breath, that long, slow exhale, too controlled, too close, too human in the shape of something that wasn't. My pulse quickened again. Then something shifted in the van, not loud, not violent, just a single soft tap on the rear cabinet, then another, then a long slide, like fingertips drifting along the interior wall. I forced my eyes forward. I kept driving, my breathing shallow, controlled. I didn't turn around, didn't check the mirrors, didn't speak, didn't let myself think beyond the next mile marker. But I could feel it. Something sitting quietly in the back of the van, not moving toward me, just watching. I drove through 3 more towns, each one brighter and more populated than the last. The noise grew louder, kids shouting in parking lots, cars honking, music pouring from open windows, life everywhere. And still, the presence lingered. Not stronger, not weaker, just patient. It wasn't until I reached a large city, Denver, that the tapping in the back stopped. The air in the van lightened, as if something exhaled one last time and drifted away. I pulled into a crowded grocery store parking lot and finally let myself breathe deeply. For 10 long minutes, I sat there without moving. I didn't hear anything unusual, didn't feel anything hovering just behind me. The silence in the van felt like true silence for the first time since Eagle Wash. I turned slowly and looked into the back. Nothing, just my gear, my blankets. My backpack tipped over slightly from the long drive. The shadows fell where they should. Nothing was out of place. Relief washed over me so hard my eyes stung. But even as I sat there alive, safe, surrounded by people, something settled into me like a cold truth whispered on a warm day. The forest doesn't need to follow you physically. Fear is a seed. All it has to do is plant itself. And once it's there, once it burrows deep enough into the places you keep quiet and hidden, it never leaves completely. It waits, it watches. And sometimes when the world grows still, when the road darkens and the noise of people fades, you feel it again. That soft, deliberate breath at the back of your neck. I left Eagle Wash behind me, but something from it never left me. And some nights, when the van creaks in its familiar way, when the wind stalls, when silence settles too heavily, I hear those slow footsteps circle me again. Mapping, measuring, remembering. And even though I keep moving, keep searching for brighter places, safer trails, more crowded campgrounds, I know the truth now. Some journeys don't end when you leave the wilderness. Some journeys follow you home. Debunking legends sounds easy, until you're the one trapped in the dark, terrified that the legend wasn't a legend at all. My name is Colin Mercer. I'm 43 years old, and I have a habit of chasing the stories other RV campers whisper about. I don't do it for views or shock value. I do it because I've seen good people avoid experiences that could change them, all because some rumor said a place was cursed or haunted or dangerous for reasons no one could ever explain. I believe that truth should always be stronger than fear. I believe that legends should be exposed. But that was before the night I stopped believing every horror was fiction. I bought an old Volkswagen camper van 2 years ago. It rattles, it smells like oil and sun-rotted leather, and the fan squeals whenever I shift into third. I named her Lola. Lola has carried me into the kinds of places most RVers pass right by. Forgotten campgrounds, unmarked trailheads, national forests where cell service is just a rumor. I say this without ego. I thought I was immune to getting scared. I'd seen enough strange things to become numb. But I still believed everything had an explanation. Every shadow belonged to an animal. Every voice belonged to a person. Every fear belonged to the imagination. That changed at Briar Run Campground, a place with a reputation, a legend, a warning passed around campfires and Facebook groups. Don't stay there overnight, not even once. The story shifts depending on who's telling it, but the roots are the same. People vanish there. No bodies, no clues. Just empty campsites left behind as if their owners simply stepped out and dissolved into the air. Locals say the woods there don't like visitors. They say the trees move. They say the forest watches. I laughed when I read that. Southern West Virginia has thick forests, sure, and enough wildlife to keep you on edge, but trees shifting around like predators? That sounded like a child's ghost story. So I decided to go, to lay the rumors to rest, to debunk the legend of Briar Run once and for all. The drive-in was peaceful at first. Rolling hills, broken rural highways, cows grazing in fields where fog curled around their hooves. The kind of countryside that feels quiet because the land remembers old trauma. The kind where your headlights find houses missing more windows than they still have. As daylight melted into dusk, I turned onto a narrowing gravel road. Lola's tires spit stones and kicked dust into the darkening air. The trees closed in, crowding the path with branches that looked like hands. When the campground finally appeared, a flat clearing surrounded by tall pines, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear, just pressure, like I'd stepped somewhere I didn't belong. I parked in the far corner, close to the tree line. There were no other campers. The registration board clung to its post like it hadn't been checked in years. A rusty swing set stood crooked near the center of the clearing, one chain higher than the other. Everything looked still. Too still. I set up camp, trying to ignore the sense that the forest was waiting for me to do something wrong. By the time the last sliver of daylight was gone, the air felt heavy, wet with the smell of soil that hadn't seen sun in weeks. I cooked dinner on a small grill, a can of beans that tasted like salt and metal. Every time I turned my head, I caught something just outside the lantern glow. Not movement, exactly. A presence. A pressure on the side of my vision, like someone standing close enough to breathe on my ear. I kept telling myself the same thing. Everything has an explanation. I tried to focus on the sounds of the woods, but that didn't help, because there were no sounds. No crickets, no owls, no rustle of leaves from nighttime hunters. Just silence. Silence so complete it became noise. I sat back in my camping chair and stared into the dark. The trees looked wrong. Uniform, perfectly spaced, like soldiers standing in formation. Wind should have bent them, age should have twisted them. But these trees stood straight and tall as if they were holding their breath. I told myself I was imagining it. That fear was a trick of a restless mind. That's what I specialize in, finding the truth beneath the emotion. Then I heard a sound. Click. One single sharp click from the woods, like a stick snapping but too clean, too deliberate. I stood up, lantern in hand, and faced the tree line. My pulse crawled up my throat. The silence pulled tighter. No breeze, no rustling, nothing. Until another sound. Click. Same pitch, same distance. I swallowed hard. Probably a deer, I whispered, but my voice didn't carry like it should have. Not in a clearing this open. I angled the lantern toward the trees. Its light splashed across the bark, and that's when I realized what was wrong. The trunks closest to me had changed positions. Not dramatically, just inches, but I was certain one of them had been further back. The spacing was wrong now, the symmetry broken. I stared so long my eyes burned, trying to convince myself I hadn't made a mistake. Shadows trick people. Fear rearranges memory. But deep inside, my instincts screamed something I'd never admitted before. Legends exist because someone once saw the truth. The lantern flickered, the flame stretched tall, then shrank small, as if something were sucking the oxygen from the air. Sweat crawled across my neck. I took a step back, closer to Lola, back toward something with walls I could shut. That's when I heard it again. Click. But this time, there wasn't just one. Dozens of clicks answered from deeper inside the woods. Too many branches snapping at once, too many creatures moving all together, like a synchronized breath. My heartbeat thundered. I backed up faster, eyes locked on the darkness. But the darkness seemed to lean forward, closing ground, hungry. Finally, the primal part of my brain made the decision my reason refused to accept. Get inside. Get walls between you and whatever is out there. I lunged for Lola's door, swinging it shut so fast the metal thundered against its frame. I stood in the cramped interior, breathing like I'd just outrun a wildfire. Lantern light pulsed against the thin curtains covering the windows. The van felt too small, too flimsy. I was surrounded by glass, surrounded by a forest that might not follow the rules I knew. I turned off the lantern and waited, letting my eyes adjust. The night outside was darker than any sky I'd ever seen. It felt like staring into ink. For several minutes there was nothing. Then, tap. A single tiny knock on the side of the van. I froze. Tap. Same spot, same rhythm, like fingers, like someone or something wanted to see if I'd answer. My throat tightened. Every rational explanation I'd spent years clinging to broke apart like weak string, because animals don't knock, and the trees outside Briar Run Campground had moved. Tap. Slower now, almost playful. I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I couldn't stay here. Not until morning. Not until my nerves collapsed. If I waited long enough, whatever was out there would lose patience. And I wasn't going to wait to find out what happened then. I had to escape. I had to leave. And I had to accept something I'd never believed. Some legends aren't fiction. Some legends are warnings. I didn't turn on the engine right away. I just stood there inside that dim, cramped space, listening to the taps on the metal, waiting for them to stop, waiting for the forest to lose interest. It didn't. Tap, tap, to tap, tap. Not loud, gentle, like knuckles against a bedroom door late at night after everyone else is asleep. I reached for the key in the ignition, moving slowly as though sudden motion would trigger something outside. My fingers brushed the cold metal ring. Sweat made them slip. I tightened my grip, twisted the key. The engine coughed. Once, then died. Lola never failed like that. Not ever. I swallowed hard and tried again, forcing myself not to look toward the window. Not to think about the fact that the tapping had stopped the second I touched the key. The engine sputtered, rattled, then caught with a rough growl. My heart jolted with relief. I threw the van into reverse. The headlights blasted against the wall of trees, just trunks, just bark, until the branches shifted into view and I noticed something horrific. The path I'd driven in on was gone. It should have been right there, a straight corridor leading out to the gravel road. But now, the forest had choked it off. Trees, too many trees, stood shoulder to shoulder like they'd grown up from the ground in the last 15 minutes, forming a barrier where open trail used to be. I panicked, threw Lola into drive, tried another direction, any direction that wasn't toward that tapping. The van lurched forward onto soft ground. Mud grabbed at the wheels, sucking them down. Tires spun, flinging dirt. No, come on, come on! I pumped the gas harder at the van, shaking like its bolts would grind apart, but the mud only swallowed deeper, thick and hungry. The headlights flickered, then the engine stalled again. The silence that followed felt like the moment right before a scream. I leaned forward, forehead against the steering wheel, trying to breathe, trying to think, trying not to understand what I already knew. Briar Run didn't want me to leave. Outside, something scraped lightly across the back of the van. No tapping this time, just a slow drag like fingernails trailing down the paint. I spun around, staring at the curtains, knowing I wouldn't look, refusing to look, but terrified that something might look back. The dragging stopped. Then, crunch, under the van, as if something heavy pressed down on the roof. I sat perfectly still, lungs locked, afraid air itself might provoke whatever was above me. The roof moaned, metal bending under shifting weight. The van rocked slightly. Something was up there, breathing, slow, wet. Then another sound, a whisper. Not a voice. Leaves? No. Movement? No. It was the sound branches make when they bend, when wood strains under force. Like a tree was leaning forward, closer, closer. I couldn't stay blind. I had to see. Even if it broke me. I grabbed my flashlight, hand trembling so badly I nearly dropped it twice. I pressed the curtain aside a fraction of an inch, just enough to peek out. My flashlight beam shook wildly, bouncing against tree trunks. And there, right at the edge of the beam, stood a shape. Tall. Thin. Too thin. A column of bark-like skin, ridged and cracked like a trunk, but with angles and joints and the faintest outline of shoulders. Its surface wasn't still. Tiny fibers writhed like roots searching for soil. Eyes, if they were eyes, glowed pale and milky in the beam. I snapped the curtain shut and fell backward onto the back seat, flashlight clattering against the floor. My chest seized. My breath fought against my lungs. My brain scrambled for rational explanations, but reason had nothing left to offer. Trees don't watch, trees don't move, trees don't climb onto vans. I don't remember deciding to scream. It just erupted. The roof weight shifted fast. Scuttling movement like something getting ready to pounce. I scrambled to the front seat, hand slamming the key again. The engine roared alive. This time, I didn't hesitate. I jammed the gas pedal to the floor. The wheels screamed in the mud, spitting chunks of earth. The whole van lurched, bounced, tipped, and suddenly broke free. Lola surged forward, headlong into darkness, bouncing over roots and stones I couldn't see. Branches slapped the windows. Something slammed against the side panel. Leaves smothered the windshield as if the forest itself tried to hold me down. I drove blind, praying, bargaining, crying out that I didn't want to know the truth anymore, that legends should stay legends, that I'd leave Briar Run forever if the forest just let me go. A gap emerged ahead, a sliver of openness between trees. I aimed for it without knowing where it led. The van burst through a veil of hanging branches, and suddenly I was back on the gravel road, fishtailing as rocks skittered against the undercarriage. I didn't slow down, not for a second. I drove until the trees thinned and the first distant glow of a town appeared on the horizon, a dim orange halo of safety. My hand stayed locked on the wheel long after I rolled into a gas station parking lot, screeching to a stop beside the pumps. The lights were harsh, too bright. The real world returned with fluorescent buzz and the smell of gasoline. But my heart still lived in that forest. My ears still strained for tapping. I sat there in the driver's seat, shaking uncontrollably, palms bleeding where the keys had carved crescents into my skin. A woman stepped out of the gas station store, arms crossed tight against the cold. She looked at me, then at my muddy van. "You look like you ran straight through hell," she said. I tried to laugh. It came out broken. "Something like that." She approached slowly, cautious. "Where'd you come from?" I hesitated. Did I tell her the truth? Would she believe me? "Briar Run," I finally said. Her face went pale. "You shouldn't have gone there. People know better." I closed my eyes, head falling back against the seat. Her voice quivered, not with superstition, but memory. My husband, he disappeared there 10 years ago. I opened my eyes. She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid for me. He went camping just like you, she continued. Everyone told him not to. He liked proving people wrong, liked showing fear was just a story you let yourself believe. She swallowed hard, voice cracking. He never came home. I stared at her, feeling something cold twist deep in my gut. What do you think happened to him? I whispered. She didn't hesitate. I think the forest chooses. Some it lets go, she said, eyes locked to mine. Some it keeps. Her gaze drifted to the woods behind me, far beyond the gas station lights. You're lucky you're not one of the ones it wanted. I wanted to correct her, tell her I was there to debunk the legend, that I was a man of logic, that I didn't believe in forests with intentions or trees with eyes. But I couldn't, because I had looked into those eyes, and they had looked back. I thanked her quietly, rolling up the window. She lingered as if expecting me to vanish if she looked away. I drove to the far corner of the lot, parked beneath a flickering sodium lamp, and sat in the stillness, trying to stitch reality back together. I told myself it was over. I had escaped. But escape isn't the same as survival, and as dawn finally bled into the sky, I saw the first proof that Briar Run wasn't done with me. On Lola's roof, 4 long gouges in the paint, carved deep and spread evenly apart, like fingers or roots, reaching, searching, marking what the forest had claimed. I never slept that night. I never turned off the engine again. I didn't even step outside until the sun was fully awake and the world felt solid again. But fear doesn't disappear with daylight. It just hides in the places we refuse to look. I left that gas station with only one thought running through my mind, circling, tightening. Some legends are not meant to be debunked. Some are meant to be obeyed. I drove for hours that morning without choosing a direction. I just needed distance, concrete, civilization, noise, any place that didn't smell like wet dirt and silence. The gouges on Lola's roof caught the sun every time we hit a bump, little flashes of metal like reminders that I wasn't just imagining what happened. Eventually, I ended up at a public campground near the New River Gorge. Clean restrooms, families eating breakfast at picnic tables, kids throwing frisbees. Normal, safe, real. I sat there in the driver's seat, engine still running, and forced myself to breathe. A ranger walked over, mid-60s, pale green uniform faded by decades of sun. He tapped the window. Not like the tapping in Briar Run, just a normal human knock. I lowered the glass. You planning to park here today? He asked. Yes, I said too quickly, voice scraped raw. You all right, son? His eyes scanned my face, then drifted to the scratches on the roof. His expression shifted. You drove past the Briar Run turnoff this morning, didn't you? He asked quietly. My stomach dropped. How did you? I've seen folks look like you look. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Folks who should have died out there. I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh. He didn't. You ever notice, he continued, most local legends don't come from newspapers or history books? He pointed toward the families playing cornhole nearby. They come from people like them, ordinary people who witnessed something they weren't supposed to and got lucky enough to run. I swallowed hard. I tried to form the question, but he already knew what I wanted to ask. No, he said. You won't find stories about Briar Run online. You won't find names. The forest doesn't give back evidence easy. His gaze hardened. But you should leave West Virginia tonight and don't take the back roads. A laugh almost escaped me, desperate and shaky. You can't be serious. He leaned in close enough that I could smell his coffee and mint gum. Son, the serious ones are the ones who come back shaking like you. He stepped away, gave a small nod, and walked off toward the visitor cabin. A chill ran through me. Not fear this time, but something else. Recognition. I wasn't done with Briar Run, and Briar Run wasn't done with me. Even after a week, I couldn't sleep. Every night when I closed my eyes, I saw bark that moved like muscle, saw pale eyes tracking me from the dark. Every tapping sound, whether it came from a window, a wall, or a tree branch in the wind, made my body freeze. Eventually, fear wasn't the problem anymore. Curiosity was. I had spent years exposing myths as nothing more than misunderstandings, campers seeing what they wanted to see, people sharing stories without asking questions, irrational fear passed down like a family heirloom. But this wasn't irrational. This wasn't misunderstood. And a truth like that doesn't let go easily. So I went back. I know how that sounds. I knew it sounded insane when I made the decision. But legends don't grow from silence. They grow from unanswered questions. I thought if I just returned with the daylight on my side, maybe I could piece together what happened to me. Maybe I could find proof. Maybe I could finally separate fact from fiction. Lola protested every mile back toward Briar Run, engine coughing like it was sick of the idea. I stocked up on tools, a bigger light, spare fuel, anything that made me feel more in control. By the time I reached the forest again, the sun was still high, the sky blue, birds chirping, a world that made monsters seem ridiculous. The gravel road appeared ahead exactly as before, but this time my pulse didn't spike. The forest looked like forest, nothing more, trees, leaves, branches. If I hadn't lived through that night, I'd have laughed at myself. I stopped Lola at the entrance to the campground and stepped out into the daylight. The air smelled earthy, normal. I scanned the space. It looked the same. Empty, quiet. But nothing moved. No whispering wind, no misaligned trees, just a place. A place with scars. In the far corner where I'd parked before, the ground still bore the trenches from Lola's tires, the scars of my desperation. Mud hardened into claws. I walked toward the tree line, careful, attentive. I counted the spacing between the trees, took photos, noted every detail. 23 paces from the campsite, I found something that made my entire body lock up. A piece of metal, silver paint, curved edge, torn from a vehicle, torn from my vehicle. I crouched down and lifted it carefully. It was one of the fragments ripped off Lola's roof when that thing pressed down on us. Proof. Fear rose again, but so did something else. Validation. I set the fragment in my pocket and continued deeper into the trees. The light dimmed slowly, as though every step leached away more of the sun. Birdsong faded. My breath became louder, sharper. That familiar pressure, the sense of trespassing, returned like a slow tightening of the air. I stopped walking, because a sound broke the silence. Click, exactly like before. Not loud, not close, just enough. I turned toward the sound, flashlight in hand, though daylight still clung stubbornly to the ground. The beam jittered across bark, and I saw gouge marks, long, parallel, carved into the trunk, fresh. A warning? Or a message? Click. This time behind me, I spun, heart slamming against my ribs. Another tree bore marks, deeper, cleaner. Rails, claws, fingers. I needed to go. I needed to leave with what I already had. Proof, evidence. Enough truth for a lifetime. Click. Closer now to my left. I didn't wait. I turned and sprinted back toward the clearing, crunching through underbrush, lungs burning. Branches whipped my arms and chest. My boots hammered the dirt so hard I nearly tripped twice. When I reached the sunlight again, I didn't look back. I threw myself into Lola, slammed the door, and drove without breathing. As I burst back onto the gravel road, something flickered in the rearview mirror. Just a shape, tall, thin, motionless in the center of the clearing. Watching. I didn't slow down until I reached a diner 20 miles away where families laughed over milkshakes and no one had ever heard of Briar Run. I parked where I could see all the exits. My muscles wouldn't relax. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I had proof now. Tangible proof. But that didn't give me peace, because proof meant the legend was real. I stayed in a motel that night, doors double locked, curtains pinned shut, and it was there, staring up at the stained ceiling, that the truth sank in. We don't tell legends to entertain each other. We tell them to protect each other. Every warning carries a cost. Someone had to meet the danger before the story could exist. Just like I did, just like the woman's husband did, just like countless names we'll never know. I realized then what my work really meant. Not debunking legends, not calling fear foolish, but showing people that fear can be a guide. Because there are places in this world that don't want us, places that don't obey the rules we pretend are universal, places where nature isn't a backdrop, it's a predator, and Briar Run is one of them. I used to believe that truth should always be stronger than fear. Now I believe something else. Fear is sometimes the only thing that keeps us alive. So if you ever find yourself on the highways of southern West Virginia and you spot a narrow gravel road with a carved wooden sign that once said Briar Run Campground before the letters faded, do not turn in. Do not park there. Do not step foot past the tree line. You might think you're brave. You might think you're experienced. You might think stories are just stories and fear is something you've overcome. But listen to me closely. I thought the same thing. And before that night, I had spent an entire life separating truth from lies. Now I spend every night praying that the lie doesn't come knocking again, because legends aren't born from fiction. They're born from the screams of those who didn't escape. They're warnings carved into memory, passed between survivors. They're promises. If you ignore us, you won't get a second chance to learn. I am Colin Mercer, a man who once thought fear was weakness, who once believed legends were just stories. Now I know better. Now I listen, and you should too. I didn't plan on stopping at Crater Ridge that night. It was supposed to be a simple push across the high desert, a straight shot toward Flagstaff with the kind of empty, humming horizon that makes you forget how big the world is. But the sky had begun to bruise with sunset, and the wind kept nudging my old Volkswagen like it was trying to herd me somewhere. I remember glancing at the dashboard clock, realizing I'd been driving longer than I meant to, and feeling that quiet, needling tug behind my ribs that said I should pull off before exhaustion twisted something in my judgment. Crater Ridge wasn't on any route I'd planned. I saw the sign at the last second, half-tilted, sun-faded, as if trying to hide its own name. I flicked on my blinker and rolled over gravel that crackled like burnt paper under my tires. The campground was small, the sort of unofficial pull-off that looked like it had been carved out by weather rather than design. My headlights skimmed over 2 picnic tables, a stone fire ring, and a drop-off into black nothing. The ridge hung open to a wide basin dotted with low shrubs and pale rock shelves that looked like scales on a giant buried creature. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, letting my ears readjust to the world outside the steady rumble of the road. The desert breathed around me, slow and cool. Something in it felt watchful, but not hostile, the way a canyon might hold a voice long after the speaker has gone. I stepped out and stretched. The air smelled faintly metallic, a sort of warm copper tang. I'd caught that scent once before, years ago, driving through the Nevada flats near Cloudhouse Wash. Back then, I blamed a distant storm. But there wasn't a cloud in the sky now, only a wavering band of gold lights smeared low along the horizon, like someone had dragged a brush across the edge of the world and forgotten to stop. As I set up for the night, I kept hearing something beneath the wind, a rhythm that wasn't quite natural, a soft tapping spaced evenly, almost polite. It reminded me of knuckles resting gently against a wooden door, not knocking yet, but waiting. When I paused to listen, it stopped. When I moved, it returned, faint and steady, as if tied to the motion of my breath. I've learned not to trust the desert after dark. It repeats things. It carries fragments of sound that don't belong to the place you're in. Maybe that's why the tapping felt less unnerving than it should have. I chalked it up to shifting branches or loose gravel ticked along by the wind. My Volkswagen creaked as I settled inside, the interior already cooling in the open high country air. Inside my van, I flicked on the small battery lamp above the kitchenette. Soft light warmed the walls, and for a moment I felt anchored again. But when I reached into the cupboard for the small journal I kept on the road, my fingers brushed something cold and unfamiliar. A small metal object, smooth edges. No weight to speak of. I pulled it out slowly. It was a thin strip of metal about the length of my palm, marked with a symbol I'd seen once but couldn't remember where. It looked like a trail line, except instead of showing elevation or direction, it branched into delicate veins. None of the lines led anywhere. They just stopped, as if the map had been interrupted or erased. I felt the smallest tightening in my chest, a slow coil of recognition with no memory behind it. I set the object aside, telling myself it had been in the van all along. Maybe from a hardware store run, maybe something I picked up on a hike months ago. Memory is slippery when you rely on it too much. I unrolled my sleeping bag. Outside, the tapping came again. This time, it was closer. I flicked off the lamp and sat still, letting my ears calibrate. The desert has a way of holding its breath with you, and sometimes that's the most terrifying thing about it. When everything goes still at the same time, you can't tell if you're listening to silence or waiting for something to step into it. The tapping started again, softer than before. I opened the side window curtain just an inch. The moon hadn't risen yet, but faint starlight silvered the ground outside. At first, I saw nothing. Then I noticed a faint glow, thin, as if coming from beneath the dirt itself. A line of light pulsing along the ground, fading, returning, fading again, like a heartbeat. My scalp tightened. I heard myself whisper into the dark, "No, not again." I didn't know why I said it, not with my conscious mind, but something old inside me recognized that glow. The same way you recognize a voice from a dream once you're finally awake. I grabbed my boots and stepped outside. The chill hit me with a quick snap. The ridge felt wider than it had moments before, almost stretched like the land had inhaled. The glowing vein traced a line across the ground near the fire ring, snaking toward the ridge's edge. The pulse traveled through it in steady intervals, warm in color but cold in presence. I knelt beside it. The dirt didn't feel disturbed, no trench, no heat, no vibration, just the faint, breathing light threading the desert floor. When I reached out toward it, the wind whispered something across my ears. A word, a phrase, too soft to make out, yet familiar enough that my stomach twisted. I'd heard it before, maybe in a video, one I watched late at night about unsolved desert phenomena. But when I tried to remember the title, all I found was static, like someone had erased the file from the inside of my mind. The tapping resumed, but this time it wasn't on wood or gravel. It came from beneath my feet, a hollow, measured sound. Tapping once, pausing, tapping twice. A simple pattern, but something about it made my legs tense. I stood and backed toward the Volkswagen. The glowing vein dimmed, then flared slightly, almost reacting to my movement. A voice carried from the far end of the campground. "You see it too?" I froze. A man leaned against the shadows near the second campsite. I hadn't seen another vehicle. No headlights, no engine noise. His figure looked worn down, wrapped in a canvas jacket that fluttered in the wind like it was remembering better days. I called out, "How long have you been there?" He shrugged, as if the question was too fragile to answer. "Long enough to know the ground's alive tonight." My mouth went dry. "This normal for here?" He didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. He just tilted his head slightly, eyes settling on the glowing vein near my boot. "It's been happening in places it shouldn't. Ridge lines, washes, old trail beds. Folks used to talk about it on that blog, Trail Hour Archives, the one that got wiped. Wiped. The word hit a nerve in me. That quiet, uneasy recognition I'd been trying to ignore, sharpened behind my ribs. Something about the name Trail Hour Archives rang a bell, like I'd stumbled across it months ago, only to find every post replaced with a single message: "This path is closed." I stepped closer to him, keeping a safe distance. "What do you think it is?" He shook his head. "Not what, when." He pointed to the ridge. "They say these veins show up where the land remembers something before we do." A gust of wind swept across the basin, cold enough to make my eyes water. When I blinked, the man was gone. Not vanished, just gone. As if he'd stepped out between one blink and the next, leaving only the desert's breath behind him. The glowing vein brightened for a moment. Then the tapping started again. Harder this time, urgent. I backed into my van, shut the door, and locked it. The air inside felt sealed but thin, like I'd trapped something in here with me. My breath came quicker, fogging the window. The tapping shifted to my right, skittering along the ground as if circling. I pulled the metal object from the counter. The strange map. The veins etched into it seemed to glow faintly now, mirroring the pulse outside. The tapping stopped. Silence folded over the ridge. For one fragile moment, I felt the world hold still. Then, somewhere beneath the Volkswagen, the ground exhaled with a sound like static rising through stone, and the faint copper smell drifted through my vents again. I pressed my forehead against the cool steering wheel, trying to anchor myself to the normal, the hum of the old engine, the soft creak of the van as it settled on uneven ground. My mind raced, tracing everything that had happened. The tapping, the vein of light, the vanished man, and that strip of metal with the strange branching lines. I kept telling myself I was seeing patterns where there were none, that my imagination, fatigued by a long drive, was layering fear onto an empty desert. But something about the air told me otherwise, the way it seemed to hum quietly, vibrating faintly against the van's panels. It was like listening to a tuning fork struck somewhere deep in the earth. I thought about leaving. The road was right there. A simple backtrack along gravel and asphalt would get me out of the basin before sunrise. But I couldn't move. Not yet. Part of me had to understand what I was looking at. Part of me feared what I might find if I did nothing. The vein of light hadn't disappeared. It threaded toward the edge of the ridge, pulsing like a heartbeat in the desert. I tried to recall every detail of the Trail Hour archives. I remembered fragments, screenshots of glowing lines snaking through washes, images of footprints that didn't match the scale of the people next to them, posts about travelers who had seen something just under the sand. But every time I tried to retrieve the full memory, it slipped away, like static breaking a radio signal. The posts weren't just gone. It was as if they had never existed, replaced by that single ominous line, "This path is closed." A soft rapping came at the window. Quick, insistent. Not the measured tapping from before, but irregular. My pulse jumped. I grabbed the flashlight from the side pocket of the van and swung it toward the source. Nothing. Only shadows draped over the gravel and low scrub. But the beam caught something faint, etched into the dirt near the rear tire. A symbol. Small, angular lines forming a branching pattern almost identical to the mark on the metal strip. I felt my stomach clench. My hands shook as I touched it. It was cold to the touch, unnatural, like the dirt itself had crystallized under my fingers. I wanted to call someone, anything. My phone, though, was dead. No bars, no signal. Nothing but the faint hum of the van's interior and the whispering wind outside. The wind carried a low, static-laced sound, almost like radio interference that seemed to emanate from the ridge itself. My thoughts became tangled, oscillating between disbelief and panic. I remembered an encounter on the Nevada flats years ago, metallic scents, strange shadows moving in the periphery of my vision, but I had never thought it meant anything. Until now. I forced myself to breathe. "It's just a patch of glowing minerals, that's all," I whispered, though my voice sounded small, brittle, even to me. But the moment I said it, the ground pulsed again. A wave of warmth radiated through the van's floor, subtle but unmistakable. My hands gripped the wheel tighter. The pulsing light outside was no longer confined to the vein. It spread, webbing across the dirt like a network of radiant veins glowing beneath the surface. And in the moment my eyes widened in terror, I noticed the ridge itself seemed slightly altered. The contours I had memorized while walking earlier were subtly different. A boulder I thought was small and distant now loomed closer, sharp-edged and elongated, as if the ridge had shifted while I wasn't looking. The desert had stretched. I closed my eyes, willing the sensation away. When I opened them, I saw a figure crouched near the edge of the light. Not the man from before. This one was smaller, thinner, almost bird-like, hunched over and moving with deliberate precision. Its head swiveled unnaturally, as if scanning both the ground and the sky at the same time. I blinked and it froze. Then it stepped backward, disappearing into a shadow that seemed deeper than darkness, more like a pocket folded into the world itself. I felt my sanity teetering on the edge. I wanted to leave, but the van seemed heavier now, rooted to the earth in a way that defied logic. It creaked under its own weight, a low moan vibrating through the frame, and I realized the noise wasn't coming from the van. it was coming from the ground beneath it. Every creak and groan, every subtle vibration was a heartbeat in the desert, a signal in the vast, empty basin. And with it came the metallic scent again, more pungent, more real, curling in the confined space of my van like smoke. My throat tightened. Memories of the Nevada flats, of Cloud House Wash, of other places I'd convinced myself were accidents, all rose at once. The scent was the same pulse of recognition I couldn't explain. I tried to steady myself by checking the metal strip again. Its lines no longer appeared random. They shifted beneath my fingers, subtly rearranging themselves as if mirroring the pulse outside. My journal lay open beside it, notes scribbled from weeks on the road, sketches of trail markers and old campground layouts. Some lines and symbols now seemed to echo the ones on the metal strip, though I hadn't drawn them. Had I? Or had I remembered them wrong? I couldn't tell. Memory itself felt suspect, like the desert was rewriting the rules while I watched. A sudden noise outside jerked me upright. Something slid across the gravel. Light, fast, deliberate. I shone the flashlight, catching the fleeting shimmer of movement in the distance. The vein of light had spread into faint arcs across the scrub, pulsing irregularly now, like a warning. My pulse pounded, matching the rhythm of the glowing lines. And then the tapping resumed, but closer, faster, pounding directly beneath the van, sending vibrations through the tires and frame. Every instinct screamed to drive off, to tear away from the basin and never look back. But something deeper, a part of me I didn't want to acknowledge, held me there. I had to see it. I had to understand, even if the understanding came at the cost of my own sense of reality. I unbuckled the seatbelt and stepped outside, boots crunching the gravel. The cold hit me immediately, sharper than the wind alone. My flashlight barely pierced the darkness, catching fragments of the glowing veins beneath my feet, threading toward the ridge, toward the unknown. And then I noticed them, small impressions in the dirt, nearly perfect circles, arranged in a delicate pattern around the veins. They weren't footprints, not really. Not human. But the spacing was deliberate, calculated. The pattern repeated itself, rhythmically, spiraling toward the ridge's edge. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I remembered the vanished man's words, "When the land remembers before we do." I knelt beside one of the impressions and touched it. It was firm but pliable like wet clay. And as my fingers brushed the dirt, the glow intensified for a heartbeat, then receded. And then I heard it. A whisper, low and urgent, carried on the wind. I couldn't understand the words at first. Only fragments. Don't, follow, again. And then nothing. The desert was silent, but the pulsing veins continued, the rhythm insistent, patient, watching. I staggered back toward the van. Every instinct screamed at me now. I was no longer in a desert I could navigate. The land itself had become an organism, and I was a trespasser. The metal strip lay on the passenger seat, glowing faintly, veins branching like tiny rivers of light. My hand trembled as I reached for it. I wanted to leave it behind, but I couldn't. Something in me recognized it as a key, or a signal, or a warning. The first tendrils of dawn brushed the horizon, pale and hesitant. The vein of light pulsed one last time, sharply, as if acknowledging my decision. I grabbed the wheel, my fingers white around the rim, and started the engine. The van lurched forward, tires crunching gravel, and as I turned to leave, I caught one last glimpse of the ridge. The ground seemed to pulse beneath the fading veins, breathing in rhythm with something unseen, something that remembered far longer than I ever could. And somewhere in the distance, a voice, or a memory of one, whispered, faint but unmistakable, "The desert echoes, but not always in the direction you expect." The van rattled over loose gravel as I drove away from Crater Ridge. Dawn was washing the sky in pale amber, but the warmth of sunlight did nothing to ease the tight coil in my chest. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see the veins of light still pulsing across the ridge, spreading like some living network reaching for me. But the desert behind me looked empty, silent, innocuous, too empty. I tried to focus on the road, the monotonous hum of tires over asphalt. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly it ached, and every bump in the pavement sent a shiver up my spine, a memory of the tapping and the pulses beneath my van. I told myself I was safe now. The ridge couldn't reach me once I left its basin. Could it? Hours passed. The sun climbed, turning the desert into a bright, harsh mirror. The Volkswagen's engine hummed a steady reassurance, and the desert seemed to settle into itself. I even tried to laugh quietly at the absurdity of it all. A glowing vein beneath the sand, a man who vanished, a desert that remembered before I did. Logically, none of it made sense. Yet every instinct in my body, every nerve ending, screamed otherwise. By midday, I had stopped at a small pull-off near an old wash. I needed water, needed to gather myself, needed to see if the world outside the van still felt real. As I stepped out, the scent hit me first. That metallic tang, faint but unmistakable. My stomach twisted. I spun slowly, scanning the rocks and scrub around me. Nothing moved, nothing but the heat rising off the sand and the distant shimmer of the horizon. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the van itself, the copper wiring heating in the sun, the faint smell of oil and metal mixing with dust. Maybe Crater Ridge had left a mark on me, a residue of fear that my mind translated into this smell. But the strip of metal in my pocket pulsed faintly, and the branching lines seemed to thrum in time with my heartbeat. Rational thought faltered. The object was alive, or at least responding. I kept driving, heading north. Interstate 40 stretched ahead like a ribbon laid across the desert. The world outside began to look familiar again. Road signs, rest stops, distant gas stations. But every once in a while, I would glance down at the map in my journal and catch a detail that didn't belong. A trail that shouldn't exist. A wash that curved differently. My hands would tighten around the wheel as a shiver ran down my spine. The desert wasn't finished. It remembered. Late afternoon, I pulled off to stretch near an abandoned turnout marked with faded paint. A wind stirred, carrying a faint rhythmic tapping. I froze. It wasn't loud, not urgent. But it was the same irregular pattern I had heard at Crater Ridge, the same way it had wrapped around the van in the night. My breath hitched. My pulse thumped in time with the invisible rhythm. And then I saw it. In the sand, a small impression. Perfectly circular. Edges crisp, arranged in a branching pattern, like footprints that weren't quite human, or markings made by something else entirely. I knelt beside them, tracing a finger along the dirt. The metal strip in my pocket grew warm. Veins glowed faintly along the etched lines, like a reflection of the impression in the sand. My stomach clenched. The desert had followed me. Or maybe I had carried it with me. I stood quickly, uneased, tightening my chest, and then I noticed something else. Etched into a rock near the wash was a symbol I had seen before. Not exactly the same, but close enough. The branching veins mirrored on a miniature scale, like the desert was leaving breadcrumbs or warnings or invitations. I remembered the vanished man's words, "When the land remembers before we do." I wanted to flee. Part of me screamed to leave the strip of metal behind, to abandon the journal, to forget everything about Crater Ridge, but I couldn't. Something intangible held me, some fragile thread of curiosity entwined with fear. I felt the desert pulsing beneath me, not with life as I knew it, but with memory, with echo. And for the first time, I realized the desert had a logic beyond human comprehension. Its memory didn't obey the clock or map. It obeyed something else entirely. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long and thin across the wash. The impressions in the dirt were still there, faintly glimmering in the slanting light, and the metallic tang persisted. I backed away slowly, eyes darting to every shifting shadow. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Every step toward the van seemed weighted, deliberate, as if the desert itself were testing me. Inside, I set the strip of metal on the dashboard. Its veins pulsed softly, no longer in sync with my pulse, but in rhythm with something older, slower, patient. I closed my eyes for a moment and breathed, trying to separate what was mine from what belonged to the desert. When I opened them, a faint shimmer hovered near the edge of the windshield. Light, subtle and wavering, like the memory of Crater Ridge pulsing just beyond sight. I realized then that some part of the ridge, some fragment of its memory, had attached itself to me. Not maliciously, not with intent, but simply because I had seen it, because I had acknowledged it. The desert doesn't punish or reward. It recalls, it echoes, and sometimes the echoes follow you. I drove on as darkness approached, the strip of metal dim now, but still alive with faint energy. Somewhere far ahead, I imagined other travelers, unaware perhaps of the veins beneath their feet, of the impressions forming and fading in the sand. Perhaps they had crossed similar ridges, seen similar pulses of light, only to forget them when the world insisted on normality. And I thought about the blog, the Trail Hour archives, the vanished posts, erased memories, fragments that never quite fit together. I thought about the man who appeared and disappeared like a flicker in the corner of my mind. I thought about the desert's voice, the way it whispered in wind and tapped beneath my feet, the scent of copper that had no origin. And I realized, with a strange mixture of relief and despair, that the desert had taught me something I couldn't fully name. The world isn't always what you see, and memory isn't always yours to trust. I parked the Volkswagen at the edge of a small rest area later that night. Exhausted, I leaned back and closed my eyes. Somewhere behind me, the desert stretched, veins pulsing faintly, holding its secrets. Somewhere inside me, the strip of metal rested, a reminder that the echoes of the ridge had followed me beyond its basin. I didn't know if I would ever see Crater Ridge again. Maybe I wouldn't want to, but a small, stubborn part of me knew it would never let me forget. And in the quiet, with the night pressing close and the hum of tires on asphalt still echoing faintly in my memory, I understood the desert's lesson. Its echoes were patient, unforgiving, and not always in the direction you expect. I didn't need to follow them tonight, but I knew with a deep, unsettling certainty that they would follow me. I realized too late that silence in the desert isn't empty, it's listening. The first night I parked my old Volkswagen Westphalia just outside the remains of an Arizona ghost town called Red Hollow. I told myself that fear was something you packed by accident, like an extra jacket you didn't need. I was 37 then, old enough to believe I knew the difference between instinct and imagination, young enough to still challenge both. I'd been camping alone for years, crossing states the way some people cross moods, chasing quiet places where history had thinned out and left the land exposed. Red Hollow wasn't on most maps. It existed more as a footnote in mining records and a rumor among long-haul campers. A silver boom town that collapsed before it ever learned how to die properly. I liked places like that. Forgotten towns didn't ask questions. They didn't care who you were or what you'd run from, or so I believed. I grew up in Flagstaff, not far from where the pines give up and the desert begins to breathe. My father taught me early that the land remembers footsteps longer than people do. He was a mechanic, the kind who could rebuild an engine with patience and silence. When he died, I inherited his tools and his habit of listening before acting. That habit had kept me safe more times than I could count. It also made me arrogant. I trusted my judgment the way some people trust religion. The drive into Red Hollow was a thin dirt road cutting through rust-colored scrub and volcanic stone. The sun leaned low, staining everything the color of dried blood. The smell of hot dust seeped into the van through cracked windows, mixing with oil, canvas, and old coffee. My Westie rattled softly, a familiar lullaby of loose panels and memories. I told myself I'd camp one night, maybe two, then head south toward Organ Pipe. The town revealed itself slowly. A collapsed saloon, its roof caved like a broken jaw. A schoolhouse with one wall missing, chalkboards still clinging to the far side like it refused to accept abandonment. A row of miners' shacks slouched together as if sharing a secret. I parked near what used to be the general store, far enough away to feel respectful, close enough to feel included. There was no wind. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Desert evenings usually carry a breeze, even a shy one, but the air around Red Hollow sat heavy and still, pressing against my skin. The silence felt padded thick, the way it does before a storm that never comes. I stepped out of the van, and the ground crunched under my boots, sharp and loud in the quiet. It sounded like breaking glass. I cooked dinner on the tailgate, watching shadows stretch and merge until the buildings lost their edges. As darkness settled, the temperature dropped fast, the kind of cold that creeps in sideways, finding gaps in your jacket and thoughts. I lit a lantern inside the van, its warm glow turning the curtains into thin skins of amber. That light felt fragile, like a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. I told myself the unease was just first-night nerves. New place. Old ruins. Brain filling in blanks with bad stories. I'd slept in worse places. Outside abandoned missile silos in Nevada, near dried riverbeds where coyotes argued until dawn. This was just another pin on the map. That confidence lasted until the knocking started. It was faint at first. A dull, hollow sound like someone tapping wood with the flat of their knuckle. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, not loud enough to be threatening, not quiet enough to ignore. It wasn't coming from the van door. It wasn't coming from the buildings. It was coming from underneath. I set the fork down slowly, my heart already accelerating, my mind reaching for explanations like lifelines, heat expansion, old metal settling, an animal brushing against the undercarriage. I leaned forward and listened, holding my breath as if sound might notice me. The knocking stopped. The silence rushed back in, thicker than before. I laughed under my breath, a soft, embarrassed sound meant to reassure myself. Fear loves to be fed, my father used to say. Starve it and it shrivels. I cleaned up, locked the doors out of habit more than concern, and climbed into the pop-top bed. Sleep didn't come easily. The canvas walls whispered as the temperature shifted, every tiny movement amplified. Somewhere in the distance, a sound rose and fell, not quite a howl, not quite a cry. It threaded through the ruins, echoing off stone and memory. I told myself it was a fox or a coyote, their voices warped by open space and old walls. Still, the sound carried a strange cadence, almost deliberate, as if repeating itself to be understood. I drifted off eventually, the way exhaustion always wins when you let it. My dreams were shallow and restless, filled with half-formed images of doors that wouldn't open and voices just out of reach. I woke to the smell before anything else. It was sharp and metallic, like rust and old pennies. I sat up too fast, disoriented, my head brushing the canvas. The lantern was still on, its light dimmer now, shadows pooling in corners. The smell was stronger near the floor. I slid down the ladder, every nerve awake, and crouched. There was nothing there. No spill, no animal, just the same dusty floor and my own reflection in the metal sink, pale and tight around the eyes. I told myself, smells travel oddly in the desert, carried on invisible currents. I cracked a window and the cold air rushed in, clean and biting. Outside, the ghost town looked different in the pre-dawn light. Less romantic, more exposed. The buildings stood naked against the pale sky, their shadows long and accusatory. I made coffee and drank it standing, scanning the ground around the van. No footprints but mine. No signs of disturbance. I stayed. That decision still knots my stomach when I think about it. Staying wasn't about bravery. It was about stubbornness. About not wanting to admit that a place could unsettle me without showing its teeth. I spent the morning exploring, stepping carefully through doorways and debris, reading names scratched into walls by people who believed permanence was something you could hammer together. In the schoolhouse, I found a chalk drawing, half erased by time. Stick figures holding hands beneath a sun that looked too large, its rays jagged and uneven. The chalk dust stained my fingers when I touched it, leaving white smears that felt like fingerprints from another life. I felt watched, not by eyes, but by attention, as if the town itself was aware of my presence and weighing it. By afternoon, the heat returned with a vengeance. The air shimmered, smells intensifying, old wood, bat guano, mineral dust. Beneath it all, that metallic note lingered, faint but persistent. I retreated to the van, planning to nap until evening. That's when I heard voices. They came from the direction of the saloon. low, overlapping murmurs, too distant to catch words, too structured to dismiss as wind. I sat still, listening, my pulse in my ears. The voices rose and fell, sometimes sinking, sometimes drifting apart. They sounded tired. That was the strangest part. Not angry, not threatening, just worn down. I wanted to believe other campers had arrived. It made sense. Ghost towns attract curiosity. I opened the door and stepped out, calling out a greeting that felt thin in the air. The voices stopped instantly, cut clean, like a switch flipped. I stood there longer than I care to admit, my call unanswered, the silence closing ranks around me. That was the moment suspicion took root, a quiet, invasive thing. I began to question my own perceptions. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, stress I hadn't acknowledged. It was easier to doubt myself than to accept that something else was happening. As the sun dipped again, shadows stretching into familiar shapes, I realized the desert had shifted from backdrop to participant. The land wasn't just holding the town up. It was pressing in, bending sound and smell and thought. And somewhere between denial and dread, I understood that Red Hollow hadn't forgotten how to be alive. It had simply learned how to wait. The waiting became obvious after dark, when the temperature dropped so fast, it felt like the ground had pulled the heat back into itself, reclaiming what it had lent during the day. I sat inside the van with the lights off, relying on moonlight slipping through the windshield, trying to convince myself that staying alert was a choice and not a compulsion. The desert has a way of teaching you that stillness isn't passive, it's active. It's a muscle held tight for too long. That was when the footsteps began. They weren't heavy, no crunch of gravel, no careless scuff. They were measured, deliberate, circling the van just beyond the reach of sight. I counted them without meaning to. 8 steps. Pause. 8 steps again. Whoever or whatever it was knew exactly how far to stay. Close enough to be known, far enough to remain unseen. My first instinct was human. Another camper messing with me. Someone local, bored, drunk, curious. I reached for the flashlight, thumb hovering over the switch, then stopped. Light reveals you as much as it reveals the world. I stayed still, listening, my breath shallow, the smell of cold canvas and old upholstery grounding me in the present. The footsteps stopped near the rear bumper. I heard a sound then that made my skin tighten. A slow exhale, almost a sigh, drawn out and close as if released against the metal. The van creaked softly, reacting to the subtle shift of weight. I pressed my palm flat against the floor, feeling for vibration. There was none. Just that exhale, followed by silence. I waited a long time after it left, if it left at all. Time stretched, elastic and unreliable. Eventually, exhaustion pushed me into a shallow sleep, the kind where dreams leak into waking moments. I dreamed of engines that wouldn't start and roads that led back to the same place no matter which way I turned. Morning arrived reluctantly, pale and thin. I stepped out into the cold light and found footprints. They weren't clear impressions, more like disturbances, scuffed patches where the dust had been brushed aside. They circled the van exactly where I'd heard the steps, stopping at the rear. No boot tread, no shoe pattern, just smooth arcs as if something had been dragged lightly across the ground. My stomach tightened. I crouched, tracing one with my finger. The dust smelled sharp, metallic again. That should have been my cue to leave. Instead, I told myself a different story. I told myself about wildlife, about how animals move differently, how the desert plays tricks with shadows and sound. I told myself that fear thrives on isolation and that staying another day would prove I was still in control. Control is a seductive lie. It sounds like confidence. It feels like reason. I drove the van a mile out of town that morning, following a barely visible track to a low ridge overlooking Red Hollow. From there, the town looked small, almost harmless, a scattering of ruins held together by sunlight. I sat on a rock and ate a protein bar, watching heat waves rise. From that distance, I could almost believe the town was just a place where people had once failed and moved on. By midday, clouds rolled in unexpectedly, thin at first, then thickening into a gray lid that pressed down on the horizon. The air grew heavy, charged. Smells intensified again. Creosote, damp stone, something sour beneath it all. I returned to the van, uneasy but still rationalizing, and drove back into town. That's when I met Caleb. He appeared near the old well, leaning against its crumbling stone wall as if he'd been there all along. Late 20s, maybe 30. Sunburned skin, hollow cheeks, eyes too alert for someone that relaxed. He raised a hand in greeting, casual, friendly. "Didn't expect to see anyone else out here," he said. His voice grounded me instantly. Human voice. Normal cadence. I felt my shoulders drop, tension releasing in a rush that left me dizzy. We talked for a while. He said he was from Tucson, traveling in an old pickup that had broken down nearby, waiting for a friend to bring parts. He asked about my van, complimented it, asked how long I planned to stay. I told him one more night. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the buildings. "This place messes with people," he said. "Longer you stay, the louder it gets." I laughed a little too quickly, but he didn't smile back. He looked tired again, the way the voices had sounded, worn down. "What do you mean?" I asked. He shrugged. "You hear things, smell things that don't make sense. Towns full of holes, sounds fall into them and come back wrong." I asked him if he'd heard voices. He hesitated, then shook his head. "Not voices, just echoes that don't belong to me." We parted after that, an unspoken agreement not to press too hard. I watched him walk away, noting how his footsteps barely disturbed the dust. For the first time since arriving, my unease shifted. It wasn't just about the town anymore. It was about trust, about deciding which instincts to honor and which to dismiss. That evening, the storm finally broke. Rain fell in sudden sheets, drumming against the van roof, turning dust to mud, releasing buried smells that surged like a confession. I sat inside, windows fogged, listening to thunder roll across the flats. The ruins groaned under the impact, wood swelling, metal popping. The rain felt cleansing at first, a reset. Then the knocking returned. This time, it wasn't underneath. It came from the side door. 3 knocks. Even. Patient. I didn't move. My heart hammered so hard I was sure it would give me away. The knocks came again, closer together now, almost insistent. I thought of Caleb, of his tired eyes, of the way he'd sound gets louder. I thought of opening the door, of confronting whatever waited on the other side. I thought of my father, of listening before acting. The knocking stopped. In its place came a whisper, so soft it might have been rain sliding down glass. I couldn't make out words, but I could hear the shape of them, the rise and fall of language meant for someone else. My name brushed the edge of it, not spoken clearly, just suggested, like a question asked in another room. Panic surged then, hot and electric. I grabbed the keys, hands shaking, and turned the ignition. The engine coughed, then caught, the familiar rumble a lifeline. As I pulled away, headlights cutting through rain and shadow, I saw movement near the well, a figure standing too still, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. The road out was slick, tires slipping, my grip white-knuckled. When I finally reached pavement, when the town disappeared behind a curtain of rain, I felt something loosen in my chest. Escape isn't always triumphant. Sometimes it's quiet, almost ashamed. I drove until dawn, parking at a rest area miles away. As the sun rose, I sat in the driver's seat, shaking, replaying every sound, every smell, every rationalization. Fear had followed me there, but it felt different now, less like a predator, more like a teacher. I learned that night that some places don't want to be understood. They want to be acknowledged and left alone. That instinct isn't weakness. It's memory, older than thought. When I camp now, when I park the van beneath stars or beside ruins, I listen harder. I leave sooner. And when the silence feels like it's listening back, I answer by moving on, carrying the lesson with me, grateful to still have a road ahead. I thought leaving Red Hollow would be the end of it, the way you close a door on a bad room and expect the air to change immediately, but fear doesn't work like geography. It rides with you. It settles into the seams of your thoughts and waits for familiar conditions to wake it up again. I spent the next day driving south, the storm fading behind me, the desert drying itself under a wide, indifferent sky. I stopped only when I had to. Gas, water, Food I barely tasted. Every time I shut off the engine, the sudden quiet made my chest tighten. I kept expecting to hear footsteps where there shouldn't be any. By late afternoon, I pulled into a BLM campground outside Gila Bend. Nothing special. A flat stretch of gravel, a few scattered mesquite trees, distant highway hum like a heartbeat, reminding you the world still functioned. I told myself this was a reset. Somewhere ordinary. Somewhere alive. I parked, stepped out, and let the heat wash over me. The smell here was different. Sun-warmed rubber, dry grass, faint exhaust from passing trucks. No rust, no metal tang. I set up without thinking too much, hands moving on muscle memory. Pop the top, unfold the chair, heat water, routine as ritual. As darkness crept in, I realized how much I'd been holding myself together by force alone. My shoulders ached. My jaw felt locked. Fear had burned through adrenaline and left something heavier behind. Doubt. The kind that asks if you're actually as capable as you think you are. That's when I noticed the knock marks. They were faint, barely visible in the side door panel. 3 shallow impressions in the metal, close together, like someone had pressed something hard but rounded against it. Not dense exactly. More like the surface had persuaded inward, reluctantly. I ran my fingers over them. Cold, smooth. I stood there a long time, the sky darkening above me, listening to the highway, to my own breath. Rational explanations lined up again, eager volunteers. Old damage, temperature changes, coincidence. But something inside me refused to play along anymore. I didn't feel watched. I felt followed, not physically, remembered. That night, sleep came in fragments. Each time I drifted off, I dreamed of Red Hollow, but the town was intact. Lights in the windows, laughter spilling into the street, people living their unfinished lives. In the dreams, they noticed me watching. They always noticed. I woke before dawn, heart racing, and decided I was done running from it without understanding what it had taken from me. Fear had narrowed my world before. After my father died, I spent years avoiding stillness because stillness sounded like his absence. Camping became my way of proving I could sit with quiet without breaking. Red Hollow had cracked that illusion wide open. I made coffee as the sky lightened, steam rising like breath from a tired body, and I thought about Caleb, about the way he'd said the town gets louder, about how tired he looked. I wondered how long he'd stayed, how much he'd listened. Some people mistake endurance for strength. The land doesn't. When the sun cleared the horizon, I packed up and left again, this time with intention. I didn't want distance. I wanted closure. I drove not back to Red Hollow, but toward a ranger station near an old mining district, a place with records and people who understood the language of abandoned places. The ranger I spoke to was named Marisol, mid-40s, sharp eyes, the kind of calm that comes from having seen enough to know panic is rarely useful. I told her where I'd been, careful with my words, sticking to facts, sensations, knocks, voices, smells, footprints that weren't. She listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. When I finished, she leaned back and exhaled slowly. "You're not the first," she said, "and you won't be the last." She told me about Red Hollow, about how miners had stayed too long even after the veins dried up, about families who refused to leave, convinced the land still owed them something, about disappearances that were never dramatic enough to become legends. Just people who stopped answering letters, stopped coming back. Places like that, she said, they don't trap you. They invite you to trap yourself. To keep explaining things away until you can't tell where your instincts end and the place begins. I asked her about Caleb. She frowned, thought for a moment, then shook her head. No reports, no stranded pickup, no one matching that description. That should have scared me more than it did. Instead, it settled something inside me. Confirmation isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet click of pieces lining up. I thanked her and left, the sun high now, the day fully awake. As I drove, I felt lighter, not because the fear was gone, but because it had shape now. A boundary, a lesson etched deeper than any scar. Volkswagen camping for me had always been about freedom. about trusting the road, trusting myself, trusting that if something went wrong, I could handle it. Red Hollow taught me that trust isn't blind faith. It's an ongoing conversation between your senses and your choices. Now, when I pull into a campground, I pay attention to what the land offers and what it withholds. I listen not just for sound, but for pattern, for repetition that doesn't serve a purpose, for silence that feels deliberate. I don't push past unease to prove a point. I don't stay just because I plan to. Fear, I learned, isn't the enemy of adventure. It's the compass you ignore at your own risk. Some nights, when the wind hits the van just right, I still hear 3 knocks in my memory. Even. Patient. They don't scare me the way they used to. They remind me that the road isn't just asphalt and scenery. It's a relationship, one that demands respect. I keep moving now, not because I'm chased, but because motion is how I honor what I survive, because some places are meant to be witnessed, not occupied, and because every mile I drive away from Red Hollow carries the quiet understanding that I listened in time. The desert is still listening. I just know how to answer it now. I didn't talk about Red Hollow for a long time after that. Not because I was afraid people wouldn't believe me, but because belief was never the point. The experience wasn't a story meant to be passed around a campfire for cheap thrills. It was a recalibration, the kind that quietly rearranges how you move through the world. Months passed, seasons shifted. My Volkswagen carried me through Utah canyons, California coasts, New Mexico high plains. The van aged a little more with every mile, new rattles joining the old ones, a rolling archive of where I'd been. On the surface, life returned to its familiar rhythm. Wake with the light. Drive until intuition says stop. Cook simple meals. Sleep beneath places bigger than my problems. But something fundamental had changed. I no longer chased the most isolated spots just to prove I could handle them. I didn't equate solitude with strength anymore. Strength, I learned, isn't about how long you can endure discomfort. It's about knowing when endurance becomes erosion. One night outside Bisbee, camped near another forgotten mining site, I caught myself smiling when a breeze picked up after sunset. The sound of it moving through tall grass felt honest, alive. No deliberate rhythm, no pattern asking for attention, just wind doing what wind does. I realized then how carefully I was listening now, how much quieter my own internal noise had become. Fear hadn't vanished. It had matured. There's a version of fear that panics, that floods your body and narrows your vision until every shadow looks like an enemy. And then there's the other kind, the kind that sharpens you, that whispers instead of screams, that says, pay attention, this matters. Red Hollow gave me the second kind. It taught me that the American landscape, especially the forgotten parts of it, isn't a backdrop for our self-discovery. It's not a stage waiting for us to perform bravery on. It's a living archive of ambition, loss, hope, and abandonment. Every ghost town, every empty campground, every road that fades into dirt carries the residue of people who believed they were in control right up until they weren't. When I camp now, I don't just see places. I feel their posture. Some welcome you, some tolerate you, and some remain silent in a way that asks something back from you. Respect, distance, humility. Volkswagen camping is still freedom to me, but not the reckless kind. It's the freedom of choosing awareness over ego, of knowing I can turn the key and leave without shame, of understanding that retreat isn't failure when the alternative is losing parts of yourself you don't get back. Every so often I still think about Caleb, about whether he was ever real in the way we usually mean that word. Maybe he was the land speaking in a language I could hear. Maybe he was a man who stayed too long and learned how to blend into the quiet. Or maybe he was exactly what he seemed, and the records just forgot him the way the desert forgets so many things. Not everything needs an answer to be a lesson. What matters is this. I made it out because I listened, because I stopped arguing with the warning signs, because I accepted that curiosity has limits and wisdom lives just beyond them. If you love camping in your Volkswagen, if you love pulling off the map and sleeping where history thins out, remember this. The road will always invite you forward. The land will always let you arrive. But staying is a negotiation, not a right. Trust the feeling that doesn't shout, the one that tightens your chest without giving you a reason, the one that says, not tonight. Pack up. Turn the key. Let the headlights carve a path back into motion. Some places don't want company. Some stories don't want witnesses. And some lessons only come if you leave while you still can. I did. And every mile since has been quieter because of it.